The population of Tarnow consisted approximately 26,000 were Jewish and the rest were not. It was the most evenly divided population between Jews and non-Jews in Poland. So I was 1.5 years old when the German war machine crashed into Poland. I would have been approximately 5 years old when the Nazi onslaught against the Jews reached its full fury, and I was 7 years old when we were liberated by the Soviet Red Army. So what do I remember? Well, obviously, my memories are the memories of a child, not the memories of an adult. And I can't tell you that my memories are complete. And I am not able to tell you that this event preceded another event or followed it or was simultaneous with it. But I do have some recollections which I want to share with you. And a while back, my memories were published, and my co-publisher was very intent on making sure that every fact that's recorded there is accurate. And so the memories that I am going to share with you, I can tell you, were certified to be correct by various agencies, and most of all by the Tarnow Museum. Overwhelmingly, what I recall is fear. But our fear was not like a normal fear. It was constant. You may experience a moment of fear when you're driving and somebody makes a turn in front of you and you have a moment of panic that you're going to crash, but then it's over and then you calm down. Our fear was unrelenting. It was constant. We knew that the Nazis intended to murder every Jew they could get their hand on. It was just a matter of where and when. At that time, in Tarnow, possibly in other areas of Poland and other Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, the Nazis' assault on the Jews proceeded in the following way. They would gather Jews from outlying areas and bring them to larger centers where they were confined into a ghetto. So the Jewish population of Tarnow swelled from 26,000 to 42,000 by bringing in all the Jews from little villages and outlying areas. And then, periodically, the local Gestapo would be notified that there would be a train coming by and that they should assemble 6,000 Jews or 8,000 Jews, take them to the train, put them in cattle cars where they would be taken off to the death camps. Those occasions, there was a name for them in Polish. It was called wysiedlenia. And wysiedlenia quite simply means sending away. I recall being in a room. The ghettos were extremely small. People lived in very crowded areas. My family, which consisted of my brother, was 4 years older than I. My mother and my father were in a room, and it was during a wysiedlenia, and a Nazi burst into the house, to our room, and he pointed his rifle at my father. And my brother was 4 years older than I, so he would have been about 9 years old at the time, went up and grappled with this soldier, trying to prevent him from shooting my father. And for the 10 or 15 or 20 seconds that lasted, an officer came in and shouted, "Halt, the operation is over." On that particular day, the killing of the Jews was slated to go from 10 to 12 or till 3 p.m. or whatever, and that hour had arrived. And so for the sake of the 10 or 15 seconds that my brother was struggling with a German soldier, my father survived. I recall on another occasion being held in my father's arms, and there is a prayer that Jews recite if they consider that death is imminent. I kept asking my father to recite that prayer with me so that we could go to heaven, because I expected to be killed that day. Now, what does a boy of 5, what does a boy of 5 think about heaven, earth, death, life? I don't know. But I expected to be killed that day, and if that was going to happen, I wanted to go to heaven. My father apparently kept a record, and he informed me when I was much older that on that day we recited that prayer 36 times. I recall seeing in our room we had shutters, and we could see through the shutters. And I recall seeing Jews being herded down the street towards the train station where they were going to be packed into the kettle cars and taken away. And I recall being in my grandfather's apartment, an apartment that's a bit of a misnomer. It was a single room, and it was upstairs. And my grandfather was sitting at a table, and 2 Nazis burst in, and they ordered him to come with them. And he stood up, and he picked up his prayer bag. It would have contained his phylacteries, his prayer shawl, and his prayer book. Where they were going to take him was not important to him. What was important was that wherever they would take him, he would be able to continue to keep his faith. When he got to the staircase, I guess they must have been annoyed with him because it took him some time, and he took the time to take his prayer bag. So one of them pushed him or kicked him, and he fell down the stairs. And as he fell down the stairs, they shot him. My mother, who must have been present as well, confirmed for me that my recollection was correct. I recall the night that we escaped from the ghetto. It was winter time, there was snow. Poland has much the same climate as Canada. My father took my brother and I to the walls of the ghetto. There was a wall around the ghetto so no Jews could escape. My brother scaled up to the top of the ghetto wall pretty much by himself, but I was too small to be able to do that. So my father pushed me up, and my brother pulled me up, and when we got to the top of the ghetto wall, my brother pulled me, and we fell into the snow and crouched. And we could hear shots being fired while that was going on. Other Jews were trying to escape from the ghetto, and if they were spotted, they were instantly shot. For the last 2 years of the war, we were hidden behind a false wall in the attic of a flour mill. There were 9 of us in that hiding place. My father and mother, myself and my brother, 2 young teenage girls, a young couple, and an older lady. we somehow knew what was going on in the world. We knew where the Soviet armies were. We knew when D-Day occurred. I can't tell you that we knew about it on June the 6th. It might have been July the 7th. But we knew that the Soviets were coming in one direction and the Western Allies were coming in the other direction. And we wondered whether we would make it, whether we would survive. And would we be liberated by the Soviet Red Army or by the Western Allies? And at that point, the Soviet war against the Nazis proceeded in the following way. They would launch an offensive. It would go for so long, they'd run out of steam, they'd run out of supplies, equipment, they would stop, re-equip, resupply, and then launch another offensive. Their penultimate offensive ended just east of Tarnow. And we could hear small arms fire, we could hear shelling, we could see airplanes dogfighting in the sky. And we wondered when the next offensive would start and would we make it? Would we survive till the Soviets came to Tarnow? And then one day, very early in the morning, again it was winter time, January 45, sorry. And there was a very heavy shelling, and we saw Soviet troops appear in the streets of Tarnow. And because it was winter, they were wearing white camouflage, and they moved about the streets of Tarnow very cautiously. And I can't possibly describe to you the feeling of joy and relief at realizing that we had survived. So we rushed out to try and greet the Soviet soldiers. And when I got to the head of the staircase of the attic, I started down the stairs, but I hadn't walked downstairs for 2 years. I stumbled and I fell, and I rolled down to the bottom of the staircase, and there were 3 Soviet soldiers standing there. I put my arms around the boots of the Soviet soldier closest to me, and I kissed his boots. It strikes me that when numbers get too big, they lose all meaning. If I tell you that a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons is $2, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if I tell you that a car costs $30,000, you still know what I'm talking about. But if I tell you that the budget of Canada is $12 billion, it's a very big number. But what does it really mean? Can you somehow get your mind around it? I recall, and some of you probably recall as well, that quite a few years ago, there were 2 young women, Christine French and Leslie Mahaffey, who were kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered by Paul Bernardo. And it was, every newspaper in the country wrote about that trial on the front page. And I recall, and I'm sure millions of Canadians looked at that front page and were horrified by the descriptions of what Bernardo did to those 2 young women. We could relate to that because there were 2 young women, and you could imagine the horror that they had endured. But when somebody tells you 6 million Jews were murdered, it's a very large number. But how do you relate to that number? I want to share with you two stories that, for me at least, allow me to get my mind around what the 6 million really means. In Hamburg, Germany, there were 26 Jewish children that had been collected together from France and Poland and Belgium, and the Nazis were doing so-called medical experiments on them. And when they realized about 2 weeks before the end of the war that the war was coming to an end, they decided to destroy the evidence. So they took the children down to a cellar and they hung them. The perpetrators were caught. They were judged in Nuremberg. And one of them said that the children were very small, and one of them was so weak that her weight was not sufficient to break her neck, so they had to pull on her feet to break her neck. I'm going to read to you the names of 3 of those children. Jacqueline Morgenstern was 12 years old at the time. Leah Kligman was 8, and Manja Altman was 5. It takes me approximately 20 seconds to read the names of those 3 girls that were murdered by the Nazis in that cellar. If I was to read the names of the 1.5 million Jewish children murdered by the Nazis, it would take me 290 days to read their names if I was to do it 8 hours a day without stopping, or 9 months and 20 days. The other story that brings the 6 million to mind to me was related by Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, was in a concentration camp actually in Austria. And while he was working in the yard in the concentration camp, a guard came and said, "Come with me." Wiesenthal thought he was going to be shot. It was random. It was arbitrary. There never were any reasons. So he did as he was ordered. And the Nazi took him out of the concentration camp to a hospital and into a room where a young SS-man was lying in bed, grievously wounded and about to die. And that SS-man had asked to see a Jew. That Jew happened to be Simon Wiesenthal. Where do you find a Jew? In a concentration camp. So they sat him down by the bed of this young SS-man, and the guard left and the nurse left, and the young SS-man now told him his story. How he had joined the Hitlerjugend, how proud they were with their uniforms, and how they worried that the war would be over before they could show what they could do. But it wasn't. And one day, he found himself in a small village in the Ukraine, and they were collecting all the Jews and shoving them into a house. He told Wiesenthal there were 125 or perhaps 150, and he was surprised that they could cram so many people into this one house. He also told Wiesenthal that they made some of the men carry cans of gasoline into the house. When they finished collecting all the Jews and cramming them into that house, they locked the doors, surrounded the house. An officer gave an order. They threw grenades into the house. There were explosions. There was fire. And from an upper story window, a man and a woman and a child jumped out. And the man was shielding the face of the child with his body. And when they hit the ground, they shot them. And now this young assessman asked Simon Wiesenthal to forgive him. When I read that story, which has been commented on and discussed in philosophy classes, etc., I thought to myself, just try to imagine the agony of that man and that woman and that child, and then try to think to yourself that in one way or another, this happened 6 million times. I want to now show you some pictures. Just about all of them were given to me by the director of the Tarnow Museum in Poland. Can we have the first one, please? So, this is the attic that we were in, and it's actually not the flour mill. It was a workshop in connection with the attic, and we were apparently, the false wall was somewhere over here, and that's where we were hidden. The next one, please. So this is where we were. This is the original wall of the attic, and this is the false wall that was made, and the 9 of us were hidden in this area, and you can see some of the utensils apparently that we used. That flour mill was torn down, I think in 1990 or thereabouts. They discovered our hiding place, and they called in the Tarnow Museum, and they are the ones that took the pictures, made the measurements, and documented what I'm showing you. The next one, please. And this is the back of our hiding place. Obviously, in that area, we could stand up, but in the other, we could not. The whole area was about 6 feet by 20 feet, where we slept one next to the other, and that was the whole area. The next one, please. And this is Mr. Adam Bartosz, the director of the Tarnow Museum, and he's illustrating the entrance to our hiding place. Obviously, when they built the false wall, they put all kinds of things around it so that if anybody would come up to the attic, they wouldn't recognize that it was anything other than the real wall. And obviously, they also put the entrance at the smallest possible area so it wouldn't be visible. Next one, please. Now, this is, there was 8,000 Jewish children living in Tarnow before the war. There were something like 700 or 750 Jews from Tarnow that survived. The vast majority of them had escaped to the Soviet Union. Some had survived from the concentration camps. Those 700 or 750 found the will and the strength to build the monument to the ones that had been murdered. And they built it in this Jewish cemetery in Tarnow. And this is the monument, and it has an inscription by Chaim Nachman Bialik, who recorded the pogrom in Ukraine in 1905, and it reads in Hebrew, "The sun was shining and was not ashamed." These are the Jewish children out of the 8,000 that survived the Holocaust. This is a teacher with the children, and that boy was my brother, and that little boy was me. And the next one, please. This is the monument as it is today, or at least a few years ago. This was rehabilitated by the Tarnow Museum, and this area holds a mass grave of about 6,000 people. And the next one, please. This is a Jewish synagogue that took 63 years to build. The Nazis burnt it down in 2 weeks. The next one, please. This was the center of the synagogue, and this area is what's known as the bima. This was where the prayers were recited from. And the next one, please. This is the bima immediately after the war. We had an apartment after the war which looked out onto the bima. And as a very young boy, I would look out on the bima, and you can see there were these, that was the only part of the synagogue that was left over. And you could see these wild weeds growing from the top of the bima, and that somehow seemed appropriate to me. The next one, please. This is the bima as it is today. The Tarnow Museum built this cupola over the bima to preserve it because it was obviously deteriorating, and I think that likely we lived in an apartment about there. The next one, please. And this is the building that we lived in, and you can see it's right next to the bima. The next one, please. And this is a street that's known in Polish as Żydowska ulica, which means Jewish street. And you see there's these cobblestones, and the cobblestones here are different. These cobblestones were not there in 1939. These are the original cobblestones. It's recorded that at one of the Wysiedlenias, they collected a large number of Jews in the city square, then they murdered them. And the blood was flowing down the streets because the city square was the highest point in the city. And they called in the fire department to wash the cobblestones. But the Tarnow Museum, next one please. The Tarnow Museum preserved the original cobblestones that were there, and then there is a plaque which describes the event. And the next one, please. And this is a map of Tarnow as it is today. It's much larger than it was in 1939. But in any event, the street that the Soviet soldiers came down on was this street. The flour mill would have been somewhere about here. Now this is the ghetto. This is the area that they forced 42,000 people into. And the next one, please. And this is a map of the ghetto that was made by the Gestapo. The Gestapo building was right here. And you can see that the ghetto was subdivided into 3 parts. When they killed off so many Jews, then they made the ghetto smaller. Then when they killed off some more, they made the ghetto smaller again. And so this was the final part of the ghetto. So all these pictures came to me from the Tarnow Museum. museum. And now the next slides are my own. This is one of my aunts on my mother's side. My mother had 5 brothers and sisters. My father had 5 brothers and sisters. I have no record whatsoever of my father's, of my uncles and aunts on my father's side, but I do of the ones on my mother's side. So this was one of her sisters. They were married about 2 weeks before the war. They were murdered by the Nazis, but we don't know where or when. The next one, please. This is a picture of my mother, her brother David, another one of her sisters. David actually survived the war. He was in a concentration camp. They were liberated by the Americans. The Americans were very generous. They gave him as much food as he requested. His system couldn't handle it, and he died 2 weeks later. And the last slide, I think, oh no, the second one. This is a picture of one of my cousins on my mother's side. I assume that that little boy was less than a year old because he obviously can't stand on his own yet. Apparently I had 15 cousins on my mother's side. They were murdered by the Nazis, but once again we don't know where or when. And the last slide, this is a picture of my maternal grandparents. That was my grandfather. That was shot by the Nazis. And that now brings me full circle, and it brings me to Washington. And if any of you have been to Washington, you know that not only is Washington the political capital of the United States, it's also a great city of culture. And the Smithsonian alone has something like 56 museums. And each and every one of those museums is dedicated to the achievements of humanity in art, in literature, in music, in technology. And in 1993, the United States opened a Holocaust Memorial Museum. And obviously, there was the first curator of the museum wrote a book describing all the holdings of the museum, the research that was being carried out, etc., in the museum. And at the very end of the book, he was aware that people were asking the question, why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? It didn't happen in Washington. The Americans went and fought the perpetrators of the Holocaust. 440,000 of them never came home. So why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? He was very well aware that that question was being asked. And at the end of the book, in the very last paragraph, he gave the reason why it was important to have a Holocaust museum in Washington. The Holocaust Memorial Museum reminds each of us how fragile democracy is and how vigilant we must remain in defending the core human values of individual dignity, social justice, and civil rights. Elie Wiesel, who was very influential in having that museum built, said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. Thank you for listening.
helps us gain some perspective today. We're so grateful that you would be willing to share such an amazing story. And he said something very important, how fragile our democracy is. May we never take for granted the freedom that we have. It was my privilege in the early 2000s to take a group of 15 kids through that museum in Washington. And I remember the day that we went through, how excited they were to be able to stop and to listen. And when it was over, there wasn't a word spoken for about an hour. I'm thankful that we have individuals like Israel that will share the story, that we have actual places where we can go and see the artifact and understand. And so again, I say thank you, sir, for sharing today. Thank you for sharing with the Wildcats. Thank you for helping us understand how horrific war is and how awful we treat humankind. Want to invite you to be able to come and share a meal with Israel and Anna following the service. We're going to have a prayer for the meal so you can go down and just begin to share together. And then when it comes to the dessert time, we're going to go into our Q&A. So you'll be able to ask some questions and maybe get clarification on some of the things that he shared today, or maybe you have a question you've been thinking about. So we're looking forward to that. I'm going to pray now. I'm so thankful for Jonathan and Heidi who worked to get this together today. Heidi's worked hard in many ways, and so we're just going to pray and give thanks. Father, we're grateful for this day. How horrible a story, and yet how important a story to be told. God, I pray for Israel and Ann, for the many others who have suffered such atrocities. I pray your peace and your comfort. God, may we never, ever forget. God, we look forward to a meal to share together. Thank you for a time of questions and some answers and just some dialogue with one another. Thank you again for the men and women serving all over for our protection. Thank you for the lives, Lord, who surrendered and died in the field of combat or have since died since they've come home. May we never forget. May we always remember. May we ever give thanks. And we want to give thanks for the meal that we're about to receive and for the hands that have prepared it. Go with us now. In Jesus' name, amen. Jonathan, would you take Israel and Ann downstairs?